Larissa Orlovska had never imagined that returning to her father's mountain property would feel like stepping into a stranger's dream. The gravel road that wound through the forest was narrower than she remembered, framed by trees that had grown wild and unkempt in the years since her last visit. The land, 50 acres of untouched wilderness, had been in her family for decades. Her father, a geologist who had fallen in love with solitude, had bought it to escape from noise, traffic, and people. As a child, Larissa spent her summers there, learning to identify birds by their calls, helping her father build campfires, and listening to him speak about the patience of mountains and the way time erases human arrogance. After his death, she couldn't bring herself to return for almost 4 years. The house he built, nothing more than a small cabin tucked into the slope, stood empty, the property abandoned except for the occasional snow melt and the hum of wind through pine. When she finally decided to come back, she did it out of a need to breathe again, to reclaim something that felt hers in a world that had grown cold and alien. She had quit her job in the city, packed her car with supplies, and driven for 6 hours into the mountains, convinced that solitude would heal her the same way it once healed him. But when she reached the ridge and saw the smoke curling above the trees, the sense of homecoming turned into a knot of confusion. Her father's cabin was farther up the hill, yet the smoke came from lower ground, somewhere near the creek that marked the southern border of her property. At first, she thought it might be a Forest Service camp or hunters passing through, but the closer she got, the clearer it became that this was not temporary. There were solar lights lining the path, footprints in the dirt, and a new wooden structure that looked too deliberate, too lived in. She parked her car near the old fence line and walked slowly toward it, her boots crunching against gravel, her heartbeat climbing with every step. The cabin, if it could be called that, was freshly built, modern in design, with clean wooden planks and a tin roof that gleamed in the sunlight. A small porch overlooked the trees, and a handmade sign beside the door read, "Creekside Escape." For a moment, Larissa simply stood there, frozen, trying to understand what she was looking at. Then the door opened, and a couple stepped out carrying suitcases. They were tourists, city people, judging by their sneakers and matching windbreakers. The woman smiled at Larissa as if she were part of the scenery. "You must be the owner," she said cheerfully. "We just wanted to thank you. The place was amazing. We left a review on Airbnb. 5 stars. Larissa stared at her, unable to find words. "Airbnb?" she repeated, her voice almost breaking on the word. The man nodded, lifting his phone. "Yeah, Creekside Escape, hosted by Gary. Great value, by the way. You've got something special here." He grinned, waved, and the two of them began loading their car parked nearby. Larissa watched in disbelief as they drove off, leaving behind the faint echo of laughter and tire tracks, leading straight from her land to the main road. For several minutes, she couldn't move. The cabin in front of her stood as a monument to violation. Someone had built an entire rental home on her property, and she hadn't known. She stepped closer, running her hand over the railing. The wood was polished, still smelling faintly of varnish. There were blankets inside, framed photos on the wall, even a guest book with signatures and messages from people who had stayed there. "Magical weekend. We'll come again next fall. Thank you, Gary, for being such a kind host." Each line was a stab of disbelief. Her mind raced through possibilities. Had the county reassigned her borders? Had she somehow misunderstood where her property ended? But no. She remembered helping her father hammer the metal stake that marked the southern line just beyond the creek. This was her land, without question. Someone had trespassed, built here, and profited off it for who knows how long. When Larissa finally pulled herself away from the porch and turned to look down the slope, she saw the neighboring property, a wide open space with a big house at its center, trimmed hedges, and a long driveway lined with garden lights. The sight of it made something click in her mind. She remembered the man who lived there, Gary Milton, her father's old neighbor. He had always been friendly in a shallow salesman's way, the kind of man who smiled too wide and always seemed to be measuring people. When her father was alive, Gary had occasionally borrowed tools or asked about selling mineral rights, but he had never shown real interest in the mountain itself. Now, staring at the smoke rising from the chimney of that beautiful house, Larissa felt the first sharp sting of realization. Gary had done this. He had taken what wasn't his, turned it into a business, and counted on her absence to keep him safe. She stood there until the light began to fade, her father's land quiet except for the rustle of trees and the fading hum of the tourist's car. The air was cold and thin, and the weight of disbelief slowly hardened into something else. Anger, slow and deliberate, like the shifting of rock beneath the mountain. For 3 years, strangers had walked her ground, slept under her trees, and paid a man who didn't own an inch of it. She had come here searching for peace, but what she found instead was a trespass that felt personal, intimate, and deeply wrong. The wilderness that once belonged to her family had been stolen in silence, and now that she had seen it, there would be no turning away. The next morning, Larissa woke to the sound of water dripping from the eaves of her father's cabin and the distant hum of an approaching car. The mountain air was crisp, filled with the scent of pine and wet earth. Yet beneath it lingered the bitter taste of unease that had followed her through the night. She had barely slept. Images of the strangers waving goodbye, of that polished little cabin shining smugly among the trees, looped endlessly in her mind, like a cruel joke she couldn't escape. When she finally pulled herself out of bed and stepped outside, she saw Gary Milton's black pickup crawling up the gravel road from the lower slope. The sight of it felt almost scripted, as if he had been waiting for her to discover what he'd done. She crossed her arms and stood by the porch, her hair pulled back, her jaw tight, watching him climb out of the truck with the same easy confidence she remembered from her childhood. "Larissa," he called, flashing that disarming salesman's grin. "I heard you were back. Thought I'd come up and say hello. Been a long time." His voice carried the warmth of false familiarity, the kind that tries to erase the tension it caused. She didn't return the greeting. "That cabin by the creek," she said, her tone measured but cold. "You built it." Gary paused, feigning surprise, then followed her gaze toward the small structure barely visible through the trees. "Ah, the creekside place. Yeah, I put that up a while back. Figured it'd make a nice addition to the area. Tourists love it. Keeps the local economy alive, you know." Larissa stared at him, incredulous. "On my land," she said flatly. "You built a business on my property, Gary." His grin didn't falter. If anything, it widened, as though he were amused by her accusation. "Now hold on," he said, raising his hands slightly, as if soothing a skittish animal. "There's a bit of a misunderstanding here. That part of the hill's always been kind of disputed, ever since your dad stopped maintaining the boundary markers. I checked with the county years ago. There wasn't any clear line drawn after the flood washed the creek bed out. Figured nobody would mind if I made use of it. I mean, you weren't exactly around." The words hit her like a slap. "So you decided it was yours?" she demanded, stepping closer. "You just built a cabin and rented it out for years without saying a word to me?" Gary shrugged, the picture of casual arrogance. "Not years," he said smoothly. 2.5, maybe 3. It's been good for the community. Brought in visitors, helped the shops down in town. Look, I didn't do anything malicious, Larissa. I was trying to do something positive. You've got 50 acres up here, just sitting empty. I thought you'd appreciate someone putting it to good use." She laughed once, short and sharp, unable to contain the disbelief. "Putting it to good use? You've been stealing from me, Gary. Trespassing, making money off my property." He sighed, shaking his head with the patient disappointment of a man who believed he was talking to someone unreasonable. "Come on now. No need to make this hostile. If you want, I'll draw up a small compensation agreement. A yearly cut of the earnings, say. 20%. That's generous, considering I built it, paid for it, and maintained it. The guests love it, and honestly, shutting it down now would be a shame. You could make a little cash without lifting a finger. The calmness of his tone, the way he said earnings like they were partners, made Larissa's stomach turn. She took a step closer, her eyes fixed on him. "Take it down," she said quietly. "Now." For the first time, something flickered behind his confident expression, a shadow of irritation. "You're not being reasonable," he replied, his voice hardening. "You can't just order people around like that. Look, I don't want this to turn ugly, but if you start throwing around accusations, you'll find out fast that property lines up here aren't as clear-cut as you think. I've got records, old correspondence with your father about joint access to the creek. If I take this to court, you'll end up spending more money than that cabin's worth." His tone shifted from persuasive to threatening so smoothly that it made her skin crawl. Larissa folded her arms again, forcing her voice to remain steady. "You think I won't fight this? You think I don't know where my land ends? My father showed me the markers himself." Gary smirked, tilting his head slightly. "Maybe he did, but I doubt you have that in writing. And even if you do, good luck proving anything after all these years. Lines shift, papers get lost, and memories fade. Meanwhile, I've got 3 years of tax records tied to that cabin and a file of business permits under my name. I'm not some amateur, Larissa. I know how this works." The way he said it, with that calm certainty, made her feel the cold weight of how far he'd gone to protect himself. This wasn't an impulsive project. He had planned it, documented it, and hidden it beneath bureaucratic grayness. When Gary finally turned to leave, he did it with the smug ease of someone convinced he had already won. His truck rumbled down the slope, leaving a trail of dust that hung in the still air long after he disappeared. Larissa stood in the silence, her heart pounding with fury and disbelief. She went back to her father's cabin, rummaged through the old filing cabinet where he had kept deeds and tax records, searching for anything that would settle the boundary question once and for all. The papers were yellowed, brittle at the edges, but there it was, a survey map from 22 years ago, stamped and notarized, clearly showing the creek and the southern boundary line. The cabin Gary had built stood well within her land, nearly 50 meters inside it, relief mixed with rage as she stared at the document. There was no dispute, no ambiguity, just theft disguised as convenience. She took photos of every page and emailed them to a property lawyer she found online that evening, writing a concise explanation of the situation. Within an hour, the lawyer responded, "If this is accurate, your neighbor has committed unlawful encroachment and commercial exploitation of private property. I suggest we start with a cease and desist notice." The clarity of those words steadied her, but only for a moment. Because when she checked Airbnb again that night, the listing was still active. The photos of the creekside escape glowed on her laptop screen. Smiling guests, cozy interiors, hundreds of glowing reviews. It had been there for years, hiding in plain sight, and somehow no one had questioned it. She scrolled through the reviews until one caught her eye. A post from just last month. "Gary is an incredible host. He told us the land used to belong to his family and that he rebuilt this place in memory of his late father. It felt so personal, so real." Larissa's hand tightened around the mouse until her knuckles whitened. He had even rewritten her family's history to make himself look virtuous. The realization left her breathless. This wasn't a misunderstanding, it was calculated. He had watched her father's property lie quiet, had waited until she was gone, and then claimed it piece by piece until it looked like his own. Outside, the wind picked up, brushing through the trees with a whispering sound that reminded her of her father's voice telling her to trust the land. She closed her laptop and stared into the darkness beyond the window, feeling the weight of the mountain settle around her. She wasn't just fighting for property. She was fighting for something deeper, for the right to exist without being erased. Gary had built his profit on her silence, but now that she had returned, that silence was over. 2 days later, the first letter arrived. It was folded neatly in an envelope with a local attorney's insignia printed in silver ink at the top, the kind of elegant legal stationery that tried to make intimidation look professional. Larissa found it pinned to the gate when she came back from town with groceries, flapping lazily in the cold mountain wind. Inside, the message was brief but suffocating in tone. Gary Milton, through his counsel, was formally accusing her of harassment, property interference, and defamation of business reputation. He demanded she cease unlawful disruption of his short-term rental enterprise and threatened to pursue damages if she continued her campaign to slander his good name. The arrogance of it was staggering. She stood there on the gravel path, the paper trembling slightly in her hand, staring at the words that turned reality inside out. He had stolen her land, and yet he was the one claiming to be the victim. For a long time, she couldn't even bring herself to move, listening only to the distant murmur of the creek and the low rumble of her own pulse. When she finally went inside, she poured herself a glass of water that tasted of metal and dust, sat at her father's desk, and wrote her own letter in response. It wasn't legal or polite, just a raw, unfiltered demand that he remove his cabin within 7 days or face a lawsuit. The next morning, when she drove down to the post office to send it, she noticed a new car parked by the trailhead, an expensive SUV with tinted windows and out-of-state plates. A man in hiking gear stood beside it, speaking on the phone, occasionally glancing up toward the slope where the creekside escape stood. At first she thought he might be another tourist, but as she passed, he gave her a sharp, assessing look, not the curious glance of a visitor, but the kind of cold evaluation that comes from someone who already knows who you are. The unease settled low in her gut. By the time she returned that afternoon, there were fresh tire tracks near the boundary fence and footprints leading toward her father's shed. Nothing was stolen, but someone had clearly been there. Her lawyer, a pragmatic woman named Dana who worked out of Denver, called later that day after reviewing the documents Larissa had sent. "I've seen cases like this before," Dana said, her voice calm but firm. "Your neighbor is banking on intimidation, the fake boundary dispute, the sudden legal threats. It's all smoke. But don't underestimate him. Men like this dig in when they're cornered. We'll start by filing a preliminary claim of unlawful encroachment and request an injunction to stop his business operations. Once the papers are served, he'll have to respond formally, and Airbnb will be legally obligated to freeze the listing." For the first time in days, Larissa felt something close to hope, though it was tempered by the knowledge that Gary would not back down easily. That evening, as the mountain light faded into blue dusk, she drove down the slope to the creekside cabin. She needed to see it again, to feel the reality of what she was fighting for. The place was empty now. The last guests had left the week before. She walked around the porch, noting the details: the solar panels, the rainwater barrels, the firewood neatly stacked by the door. Everything was built with precision, almost care, which somehow made it worse. Inside, the air still held the faint sweetness of pine oil and old smoke. She ran her fingers over the countertop and saw a framed photo resting beside a guest logbook. It was a picture of Gary, smiling broadly, posing with a couple and their child. A handwritten note below it read, "Thank you, Gary, for sharing your family's beautiful land with us." The words made her stomach twist. She took out her phone, photographed everything: the interior, the appliances, the guest book pages, the plaque by the door that read, "Milton Retreats, LLC. Evidence," she reminded herself. Cold, undeniable evidence. When she got back to her cabin, she uploaded the photos to a secure drive and sent copies to Dana. The lawyer replied almost immediately, "Good. Keep documenting everything. Don't confront him again directly." But that instruction became impossible the next morning. Gary appeared at the foot of her driveway just after sunrise, leaning casually against his truck like a man waiting for a late friend. Larissa spotted him from the porch, the pale light catching on the mirrored lenses of his sunglasses. She felt her pulse quicken, but she refused to retreat inside. When she approached, he greeted her with a thin smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Got your letter," he said. "You really think you can scare me with that?" She didn't answer, and he chuckled softly. "You're wasting your time, Larissa. You can send all the papers you want. None of them will change the fact that you've got no proof your old man didn't give me permission to use that land. There's a signed note somewhere, I'm sure of it. Maybe you should look harder through his things before embarrassing yourself." She met his gaze steadily, though her hands trembled. "You forged something, didn't you?" she asked. "You're bluffing." He shrugged, indifferent. "Believe what you want, but I'd think twice before pushing this. It's a small community. People talk, and you don't want to make enemies up here." The tone of his voice, soft, measured, full of insinuation, was worse than shouting. It was the tone of someone who knew exactly how much pressure to apply before breaking skin. For the next few days, strange things began to happen. One morning, Larissa found her mailbox torn from its post and flung into the ditch. The next, the gate at the end of the drive was left wide open, though she was certain she had locked it the night before. Once, as she drove into town, she noticed a drone hovering above the trees, following her route for several minutes before darting away. The cumulative effect was suffocating, a slow erosion of normalcy that left her feeling constantly watched. Dana urged her to file a police report, but the sheriff's office brushed her off with practiced neutrality. "It's a civil dispute," the deputy said, his tone polite but dismissive. "Sounds like you two just need to sort it out in court. We can't get involved unless there's a clear criminal act." When she mentioned the mailbox, he sighed and added, "We'll make a note of it, ma'am." By the end of the week, the Airbnb listing had finally been taken down after Dana's formal complaint reached the platform's legal team. But instead of relief, Larissa felt a dark shift in the air, as if something had been provoked. The following morning, she found a printed notice stapled to a tree near her cabin, written in bold, officious letters. "Attention, pending investigation into illegal trespass and harassment claims. Property under review." At the bottom was a signature from Gary's lawyer. It wasn't legally binding, but it was meant to humiliate her, to make it look as though she were the one in the wrong. That night, unable to sleep, Larissa stood on the porch with a flashlight, staring toward the forest. The mountain was silent except for the faint rustle of leaves and the trickle of the creek below. Somewhere in the darkness, she thought she saw a flicker of light, a phone screen maybe, or the reflection of a lens. Her breath caught, and for the first time since returning, she felt real fear. This was no longer about property lines or paperwork. Gary had turned the mountain into a battlefield of nerves, testing how far she would go before she broke. But as she gripped the railing, her father's words echoed faintly in her mind, words he used to repeat when storms rolled over the ridge. "The land remembers who it belongs to." She whispered them now into the cold night, a quiet promise to herself. She would not leave. She would not yield. If Gary Milton wanted a fight, he would get one. But this time, she would make sure it was on record, every step, every lie, every threat preserved until the truth was undeniable. The storm that had been building for weeks finally broke with the first real evidence. It came not through confrontation or coincidence, but through persistence, the slow, meticulous kind that her father had always taught her. Never shout before you measure. For nearly 10 days, Larissa had been combing through county records, tracing every document that bore Gary Milton's name. The small courthouse in the nearby town of Pinecrest was musty and half abandoned, the clerks tired and suspicious of outsiders, but persistence had its rewards. Late one afternoon, as the sky outside thickened with rain, she found what she was looking for. A series of permit requests filed under Gary's business, Milton Retreats, LLC. The permits listed his primary address, the large house on the lower slope, and then, curiously, a secondary parcel ID that didn't match any of his known property lines. When she cross-referenced it with the old survey map of her father's land, the number matched the exact coordinates of the creekside cabin. It wasn't a clerical error. It was a deliberate misrepresentation. He had registered the cabin as his own by attaching her parcel to his filings, using a joint boundary claim that had never been approved. Somehow, the county had processed it without inspection, and for 3 years, no one had questioned it. When she showed the documents to Dana, her lawyer's eyes hardened. "This isn't just trespass," she said. "It's fraud. He's been falsifying legal paperwork, maybe with help from someone inside the county office. This explains why every complaint you made went nowhere." He made sure the records backed him up. Dana leaned forward, her tone low but deliberate. "This changes everything. We can subpoena the county for documentation, and once that happens, his whole foundation collapses. But be careful. If he senses you've found this, he'll double down." Larissa nodded, though she couldn't ignore the flicker of dread behind the lawyer's words. Gary Milton wasn't just greedy. He was methodical, and people like that didn't crumble quietly. The next day, Larissa drove back up the mountain with a sense of clarity she hadn't felt in weeks. The rain had washed the roads clean, and the air smelled of pine sap and ozone. She parked by the old fence line and hiked down toward the creek, her boots sinking slightly into the wet soil. When she reached the cabin, she noticed small details she hadn't before: footprints leading from the porch to the water's edge, cigarette butts half buried near the steps, and the faint sound of a generator humming beneath the structure. She crouched to look under the deck and saw a newly installed power line, thick and coiled, leading toward the slope below, straight into Gary's property. He hadn't just built on her land. He had connected it to his grid, feeding his stolen cabin's power from his main house. That meant there would be invoices, bank records, financial traces tying his business directly to her property. Proof. She took photos, every angle she could capture, and when she stood up, she noticed something else: a motion sensor fixed discreetly under the eaves, its red light blinking softly. He had installed surveillance cameras to monitor the area. For a moment, she stared at it, her reflection tiny in the glass lens, then raised her phone and filmed it directly. "You're watching me, Gary," she whispered, her voice steady. "But now I'm watching you." That night, Dana arranged a conference call with a property surveyor she trusted, a quiet, meticulous man named Roland Shaw, who had been working in the region for 40 years. His voice came through the speaker, slow and deliberate, the kind of tone that belonged to someone who believed in facts more than opinions. "I've seen this kind of thing before," he said after reviewing her scans. "Developers and investors around here sometimes take advantage of outdated boundary records, especially after natural disasters like the 2009 flood. They redraw maps, file them under different parcel numbers, and claim the land through inaction. If nobody contests it within a certain period, the county just accepts it as valid. It's dirty but common." He paused, then added, "But in this case, your father's deed is still on record, and there's no indication of transfer or easement. This land is yours, without question. What Milton did wasn't opportunistic. It was criminal." As the conversation went on, Larissa felt the pieces slot into place with dreadful precision. Gary had used bureaucracy like camouflage, hiding theft beneath paperwork so ordinary that no one had looked twice. Dana began drafting the official motion to the district court, a detailed complaint citing fraudulent land appropriation, unauthorized commercial use, and falsified business registration. It would take weeks for the court to respond, but once the motion was filed, the cabin would become the center of a legal storm that Gary could no longer control. For a brief moment, she allowed herself to breathe. The mountain, wrapped in fog that evening, felt less like an enemy and more like an ally again. She made tea, sat by the window, and watched the clouds drift over the ridge. But peace, in stories like hers, never lasted long. At around 9, a car stopped at the bottom of her driveway. Headlights cut through the mist, sweeping across her porch. She stepped outside, holding her flashlight like a weapon, but the car didn't move. After a tense minute, the driver's door opened and Gary himself stepped out, his face half lit by the beams. He wasn't smiling this time. He climbed the hill slowly, hands in his jacket pockets, stopping just short of the porch. "You've been busy," he said quietly. "People in town talk. You went digging through records." His voice wasn't angry. It was calm, almost conversational, and that calmness chilled her more than shouting ever could. Larissa said nothing, refusing to acknowledge his bait. Gary tilted his head, studying her. "You really think a few papers are going to change anything? You don't understand how things work up here. The county, the permits, the courts, they all run on favors, not facts. You can throw all the accusations you want, but in the end, it's your word against mine. And you," he smiled faintly, "you're just a name on a deed that's been gathering dust for years." She felt the words like a hand tightening around her throat, but she forced herself to stay still. "You're afraid," she said finally, her voice low. "Otherwise you wouldn't be here in the dark trying to scare me." His expression flickered, the mask slipping just slightly before he turned to go. "Be careful, Larissa," he said, his voice carrying down the hill. "Mountains can be dangerous for people who don't know where the ground gives way." The next morning she sent Dana a detailed account of what had happened, along with the footage from her porch camera that showed Gary's approach. The lawyer forwarded it to the sheriff's office, demanding a record of the encounter. Hours later, she received a terse reply. "Noted. No criminal act observed." The phrase felt like a cruel echo of everything Gary had said about favors and facts. Yet Dana's tone remained firm. "Good," she told her. "Let them ignore it. Every silence becomes part of the file. When this goes to court, their indifference will be evidence too." As the week wore on, the case began to gather quiet momentum. Roland submitted his expert affidavit confirming the legitimate boundaries of her property. Dana filed a preliminary injunction motion that required the court to review the ownership dispute. And then, almost as if the mountain itself had been waiting for this moment, the first break came from an unexpected source, an email from a former Airbnb guest. The subject line read, "Something you should know about Gary Milton." The message was long, written by a woman named Patricia, who had stayed at the creekside cabin with her husband 2 years earlier. She explained that Gary had mentioned owning multiple parcels up the mountain and boasted about fixing county paperwork to expand his property line. He had even joked about it, saying, "People like that city girl who inherited land don't deserve to keep it if they never use it." Patricia ended the email with an apology. "If I had known the place wasn't his, I never would have rented it. I hope this helps you make things right." Larissa read the message 3 times, each line pressing deeper into her chest until she felt both sickened and vindicated. It wasn't just proof of his deceit. It was his own words condemning him. She forwarded the email to Dana, who replied within minutes, "This is gold. We can subpoena Airbnb for payment records and host communications. If he received income through fraud, it becomes not only a civil case, but a criminal one. That night, as thunder rolled across the peaks, Larissa stood by the window again, watching lightning illuminate the dark outlines of the forest. For the first time since she'd arrived, she felt the tide beginning to turn. The land outside was scarred by what he'd done, but it was still hers, and now the mountain itself seemed to stand behind her, silent and immovable. Gary Milton had turned her inheritance into a marketplace and her silence into profit. But now the silence was over. The storm had finally broken, and this time she wasn't the one who needed to be afraid. The first sign that Gary Milton understood how much trouble he was in came not through a direct confrontation, but through whispers that filtered down from town. The owner of the small grocery store where Larissa bought supplies mentioned, almost apologetically, that Gary had been talking to people, telling them she was unstable, that she had imagined the whole thing, that she was one of those city people who thinks paperwork gives them the right to ruin a man's livelihood. It was a simple, poisonous tactic, and it worked faster than she expected. Within a few days, the glances she received in Pinecrest were cooler, more measured, the polite smiles of people who had decided not to take sides. The local newspaper, which printed community announcements more often than real news, published a small column titled "Property Dispute Threatens Popular Tourist Rental." The article didn't name her, but it didn't have to. The description of the reclusive heir to the Orlovsky property was enough. Reading it over her morning coffee, Larissa felt the first pulse of panic since returning to the mountains, a sense that the ground beneath her was beginning to shift again, just as Gary had warned. When she called Dana, her lawyer sighed heavily on the other end. "It's a smear campaign," she said. "He's trying to isolate you. It's textbook. Don't engage with it publicly. Let the paperwork speak." But paperwork didn't help much when a stranger left a pile of garbage bags at her gate a few nights later, or when someone spray-painted the word "thief" in red across the back of her mailbox. The sheriff's office came once, took photos, and left with the same empty promise to keep an eye on things. The next morning, Gary stood at the end of the road with his arms crossed, watching her scrub the paint away with a sponge and a bucket of cold water. He didn't say anything, just smiled, that same smug curve of the mouth that told her he was the one orchestrating every insult. She ignored him, but the memory of that smile burned long after he drove off. Despite the hostility, the legal process moved forward. Dana had submitted the full complaint to the district court, including the fraudulent filings, the guest testimony, and the expert affidavit. But Gary responded with his own counterclaim, accusing Larissa of defamation, harassment, and financial sabotage. His lawyer, a man named Kessler, sent her a formal notice demanding $200,000 in damages for loss of income and emotional distress. It was absurd, yet it forced her to confront a reality she had been avoiding. Gary had resources, influence, and enough shamelessness to drag her through every bureaucratic swamp he could find. "He's not trying to win," Dana told her during one of their late-night calls. "He's trying to exhaust you. He wants to make this so miserable that you'll settle, walk away, or sell." Larissa stared at the empty space where her father's map used to hang and said quietly, "Then he doesn't know me at all." It was around this time that the real intimidation began. It started with noises at night, gravel crunching outside the cabin, faint footsteps just beyond the porch. Once she heard the creak of wood, the sound of someone testing the door handle. When she swung the light toward the window, there was nothing but shadows and the slow drip of rain from the roof. She started keeping her father's old hunting rifle near the bed, though she hoped she'd never have to touch it. A few days later, one of her trail cameras caught movement. A dark figure standing near the creek at 2 a.m, motionless, watching the cabin. The photo was grainy, but the posture, the height, even the tilt of the head, everything suggested Gary. Dana insisted she send the image to the police, but the deputy she spoke to only offered a weary sigh. "We can't confirm identity from that," he said. "You might want to invest in better lighting." The following week brought the hearing for the injunction. It was held in a narrow courtroom with wood-paneled walls that smelled faintly of mildew. Gary arrived in a tailored suit, all charm and confidence, nodding to the judge as though they were old acquaintances. Larissa sat beside Dana, feeling the weight of the room press against her. Kessler, Gary's lawyer, argued first, his words smooth and deliberate, painting Gary as a hard-working local businessman targeted by a vindictive outsider. When he spoke about the ambiguity of boundaries, he smiled at the judge, who didn't interrupt. Then it was Dana's turn. She stood calmly, laid out the facts, and handed the judge the documents. Deeds, maps, permits, tax filings, all precise, all irrefutable. The judge skimmed them, frowning slightly, and said, "Mr. Milton, this appears to show clear misrepresentation of parcel ownership." Gary spread his hands, playing the innocent. "Your Honor, I relied on what the county provided. Any error was administrative, not intentional." It was a performance, polished and insincere, and yet it worked just enough. The judge granted the injunction temporarily, forbidding him from renting the cabin until ownership was determined, but he stopped short of ordering its removal. It was a partial victory. Legal, but not emotional. Gary had walked away, smirking. After the hearing, Larissa drove home through a thunderstorm so fierce she could barely see the road. Lightning slashed across the sky, illuminating the trees in skeletal flashes. When she reached the cabin, her headlights swept across something that made her stomach drop, a pile of animal carcasses, 3 deer, mutilated and left near her fence. The smell hit her as soon as she stepped out of the car, thick and metallic. There were tire tracks nearby, fresh in the mud, leading back toward the main road. She took photos, her hands shaking, then called the sheriff's office again. This time, no one came. The dispatcher told her they would file the report for record purposes. She hung up and stood there in the rain, the phone heavy in her hand, the absurdity of it all pressing down until it became something else. Resolve. The next day, she installed more cameras, high-resolution ones that streamed directly to the cloud. She reinforced the locks, changed her phone number, and stopped going into town alone. But even as she tried to protect herself, the sense of violation lingered. She started to realize that Gary wasn't acting alone. One evening, she overheard 2 men at the gas station talking about how Milton was dealing with some land issue but had friends taking care of it. The tone in their voices wasn't casual. It was complicit. The idea that he might have allies willing to do his dirty work filled her with a cold, quiet rage. When Dana called later that night, she had news. "The county finally responded to our subpoena," she said. "They sent us the communication logs between Milton and the zoning department. There are irregularities, emails missing, forms time-stamped after approval. Someone helped him forge those documents. If we can prove who, this becomes a criminal conspiracy." The words made Larissa grip the phone so tightly her knuckles turned white. For weeks, Gary had acted as though the system were on his side, but now the cracks were showing. "We're close," Dana said, "but I need you to stay calm. Don't provoke him. Let him make the next mistake." That mistake came sooner than either of them expected. 2 nights later, Larissa woke to the distant sound of an engine. She checked the cameras on her phone and froze, headlights moving slowly up the trail toward the cabin. The vehicle stopped near the creek. 3 figures got out, flashlights slicing through the darkness. They walked toward the porch of the illegal cabin and began carrying boxes inside. She recorded everything, zooming in on their faces when she could. One of them, she realized with sick clarity, was Gary. Another carried what looked like construction tools. They were dismantling something, maybe hiding equipment, maybe removing evidence. She stayed awake until dawn, watching their shapes fade into the fog. When she reviewed the footage in daylight, she saw what they had left behind. A fresh set of tracks leading straight from the cabin to his property, and, near the fence, a dropped business card bearing the logo of Milton Retreats, LLC. It wasn't much, but it was enough to prove intent, enough to show that he was still tampering with property under injunction. Larissa sent the footage to Dana immediately. The lawyer's response was simple. "This is it. We'll file a motion for contempt. He's finished." For the first time in months, Larissa allowed herself to feel the possibility of victory. The fear hadn't disappeared. It never would, but beneath it was something stronger, sharper, forged from every sleepless night and unanswered call. Gary Milton had wanted to make her break. Instead, he had made her unbreakable. The courtroom was colder than Larissa expected, a place that smelled faintly of disinfectant and old carpet, its fluorescent lights humming softly like trapped insects. She sat at the plaintiff's table beside Dana, her lawyer's calm presence the only thing keeping her steady as the proceedings began. Across the aisle, Gary Milton looked immaculate, his suit pressed, his hair combed, the picture of respectability. He greeted the judge with a courteous nod and leaned back in his chair as though he owned the room. The arrogance that had carried him this far was still there, but now Larissa saw the cracks beneath it, the faint tension in his jaw, the way he adjusted his cufflinks too often, the flicker of irritation every time Dana shuffled her notes. This wasn't the swagger of a man who felt safe anymore. It was the posture of someone trying desperately to maintain control over a narrative that had started to slip away. The hearing had drawn more attention than either side anticipated. Local reporters filled the benches, whispering as they set up recorders and cameras. The town's curiosity had transformed into fascination. Everyone wanted to see what would happen to the man who'd built a business on someone else's land, and to the woman who had refused to disappear. When the judge called the session to order, the murmurs faded into silence. Dana began her opening statement without theatrics, her voice level but cutting through the stillness with precision. She outlined the sequence of events: the construction of the unauthorized cabin, the fraudulent permits, the manipulation of county records, the harassment campaign, and finally, the violation of the court injunction. Each sentence built upon the last, methodical and irrefutable. Then she played the footage captured by Larissa's cameras, the grainy night video showing Gary and his workers returning to the property under cover of darkness, carrying boxes, removing wiring, and crossing the boundary fence. The courtroom was utterly silent as the clip ended. Gary's lawyer rose slowly, feigning composure. He argued that the footage was taken out of context, that Gary had merely been securing his belongings before transferring ownership of the structure, that no laws had been intentionally broken. But his words carried no conviction. When the judge asked whether he could produce evidence of any legal sale, he hesitated, then muttered that documentation was pending. Dana didn't smile, but Larissa saw the flicker of satisfaction in her eyes. Then came the testimony of the surveyor, Roland Shaw, who confirmed under oath that the cabin stood squarely on Larissa's property and that the boundaries had never changed. After him, the county clerk, visibly nervous, admitted that some of Gary's filings had been approved under irregular circumstances, and that she had felt pressured by a supervisor who had personal dealings with Mr. Milton. The revelation rippled through the room like electricity. For the first time, Gary's composure faltered. His hand twitched against the table and his jaw tightened. When Larissa took the stand, the room seemed to shrink around her. She had rehearsed the words 100 times, but speaking them aloud made her voice tremble at first. She told the story from the beginning, returning to her father's land, discovering the cabin, confronting Gary, and the months of intimidation that followed. She described the garbage, the vandalism, the sleepless nights, and the endless dismissals from local authorities who had treated her as an inconvenience. "He told me I didn't belong here," she said, her tone steady now, that no one would believe me. He built a business on my land, then tried to convince everyone I was the problem. But this land was my father's, and it's mine now. I'm not leaving it to men who think power gives them permission. When she finished, there was a long silence. Even the judge seemed to hesitate before thanking her and asking her to step down. Gary's defense unraveled quickly after that. Every document Dana presented, every forged permit, every financial record showing Airbnb payments deposited into his business account, every email he'd sent to guests boasting of his family property, piled against him until the weight of evidence was impossible to deny. When the judge finally spoke, his tone was measured but stern. "Mr. Milton," he said, "you did not inherit this land. You appropriated it through deception, falsified legal records to sustain that deception, and attempted to intimidate the rightful owner into silence. The law does not protect opportunism dressed as entrepreneurship." He declared the cabin an illegal structure, ordered it demolished within 30 days, and required Gary to pay full restitution for 3 years of rental income, court fees, and damages for emotional distress. The total was staggering, enough to ruin him financially. But more than the money, it was the word that struck hardest: fraud. The judge's final remark sealed the room in heavy quiet. This court will not permit greed to masquerade as progress. As the gavel struck, Larissa exhaled for the first time in what felt like months. The sound echoed like thunder, final and absolute. Reporters immediately rushed forward, their cameras flashing, but she barely saw them. Gary remained seated, staring straight ahead, his face drained of color. The arrogance had vanished, replaced by something hollow, the look of a man who finally understood that his kingdom had been built on stolen ground. When he rose to leave, he didn't look at her, and that was its own kind of victory. Outside the courthouse, the air felt warmer, softer somehow. The storm that had followed her since she returned to the mountain had finally broken. Dana placed a hand on her shoulder and said quietly, "It's over. You did it." But Larissa knew it wasn't entirely over. Not yet. She still had to go back, to see the land, to reclaim what had been taken. The following week, she returned to the mountain. The creekside cabin stood empty, its windows dark, its doors sealed with the court's notice. She walked through the overgrown path, the sunlight filtering through the trees, and for the first time, the forest didn't feel hostile. When she reached the porch, she placed her hand against the wooden wall, feeling its cool, unyielding texture. Soon it would be torn down, and the ground would be hers again. Standing there, she whispered to the quiet air, "It's done, Dad. It's really done." The wind stirred through the pines, carrying the scent of resin and soil, and she thought, just for a moment, that she could hear his voice in it, steady and certain, reminding her that the mountain always remembers its rightful owner. The land was still scarred, but it was healing, and so was she. The demolition took place on a cold morning in early November, when the mist hung low over the valley and the air smelled of wet pine and soil. Larissa arrived before the work crews, parking her truck by the edge of the creek where her father used to fish. The cabin stood silent and empty, its once polished wood already dulled by rain and neglect. There was no trace of the life Gary Milton had manufactured here. No lights, no laughter from strangers who had believed they were guests of a generous host. Only silence and the steady murmur of water over stone. Watching it now, she realized how much of her own peace this structure had stolen, how it had cast a shadow over everything her father had left behind. When the excavator's arm finally swung forward and the first wall splintered, she didn't flinch. The sound was not violent, but cleansing, like the breaking of a fever. By noon, the cabin was reduced to a heap of timber and dust, and the crew packed up quietly, leaving her alone with the ruins. She walked through the debris, brushing her fingers over the fragments, bits of siding, shattered glass, a rusted nail glinting faintly in the light. It struck her how temporary Gary's intrusion had been, how fragile the empire he had built on greed. The mountain had absorbed it and was already reclaiming it, vines curling through the wreckage, soil swallowing the foundations. She picked up a piece of wood from what had once been the porch beam and tossed it into the creek, watching it drift away until it disappeared downstream. The sense of release that followed was subtle but deep, not triumph, not vengeance, just relief, a quiet acknowledgement that the balance had been restored. Over the next weeks, the hostility in Pinecrest faded as quickly as it had appeared. The local paper printed a retraction, the grocery owner greeted her again with cautious warmth, and even the sheriff stopped avoiding her calls. Gary Milton sold his house on the lower slope and left town without a word. Rumor had it he was bankrupt, forced to liquidate his assets to cover the restitution. Larissa didn't care where he went. She had stopped thinking of him as an enemy. He was just a symptom of something larger, the kind of entitlement that mistakes silence for permission. What mattered now was the land. She spent her days clearing debris, planting saplings, repairing the old fence line. The work was slow but steady, and every hour she spent under the open sky felt like a conversation with her father, an act of rebuilding not only the property but herself. By spring, the first signs of renewal appeared. Grass pushing through the scorched soil, birds nesting in the pine branches again, the creek running clear. She built a small bench where the cabin had stood and often sat there at dusk, listening to the forest settle into evening. Sometimes, hikers passing by would stop and ask if she planned to build something new. She always smiled and said no. The land didn't need more walls, it needed space to breathe. The fight had taught her that ownership wasn't about possession. It was about responsibility, the promise to protect something that can't protect itself. As the sun sank behind the ridge, painting the mountains gold, Larissa felt a quiet certainty that this chapter of her life had finally closed. The silence was no longer heavy or haunted. It was peaceful, alive, and entirely her own.